Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhone.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co.
So a few weeks ago, I was teaching a Lightroom class at Kenmore Camera, which is a local camera shop here just north of Seattle. And while I was in my class, this was a Saturday, it was a full day class, so I didn't see much of it because I was busy teaching. But I was talking to the owner afterwards, and he looked honestly kind of haggard, like he was exhausted. Apparently they had had a huge day, lots of people coming in, which is unusual for, this was a late March event. So I asked him about it, and he said a lot of people are coming in before the expected tariffs arrive. Now, again, this was at the end of March. We're recording this on April 8th. And at the time, he didn't want to encourage people to buy because of the threat of tariffs. And in fact, at the time, most of what they had in stock would probably not be affected by tariffs, or not as much, because there's not that much coming from China, for example, in a typical camera store. A lot of stuff from Japan. We now know that there are tariffs on high tariffs everywhere. That kind of blew that out of the water. But it was interesting to see people going and buying equipment, buying cameras, buying tripods, buying lighting gear in advance of these expected tariffs. And now that the tariffs are upon us, it really brings up that question of, should you go and buy a camera right now?
So we're recording this, as you said, on April 8th. The tariffs in the U.S. are supposed to take effect at midnight tonight. What's interesting is, and by the way, this is an out-of-bounds episode. We're supposed to release this a week later, but we figured this was time-sensitive. So we're releasing this on the 11th of April, and our following episode will be in 3 weeks. Anyway, what's interesting of what you're saying is that it's showing a very big awareness of what these tariffs are going to do among the public. And we're seeing a lot of this, and I'm seeing this on social media. I'm seeing this in the news. I'm seeing someone posted on Blue Sky, I think yesterday or the day before. If you're into gaming, you would know that Nintendo announced the Switch 2 the day before the tariffs were announced. And someone posted that his children are learning a whole lot about tariffs to know if they can afford the Switch 2 when it gets to the States. Now, Nintendo has actually paused, they've paused pre-orders in the States and in Canada. They just announced today. It's supposed to start delivery, I think, on the 5th of June. I think they wanted to pause pre-orders because they don't know how they're going to price it yet until they're sure that these tariffs are going to apply. If they sell it with the tariff included in the price and the tariff gets reduced later, this makes a whole lot of accounting problems for companies selling things. Apparently, as we have been seeing in the news, Apple has been flying plane loads of iPhones in from China to get them in before the deadline. Now, you said that most of the cameras in that store wouldn't be hit by tariffs. None of them would. Anything that's in the U.S. before the tariffs apply aren't affected by the tariffs, right. And which is why Apple is flying in, as many iPhones as they can. And they certainly have some stock. Apparently, they've been flying in Macs. But I think the iPhone is the emblematic device that is going to make these tariffs come home to people and make sense. You start at the base price of an iPhone 16 Pro, I think it's $999. If, again, April 8th, this changes every day, but President Trump has claimed that if the Chinese don't pull back from their retaliatory tariffs, then there will be an additional 50% on products coming from China, which means 104%. So that $999 iPhone is going to cost a little more than $2,000.
Right.
Now, this is a political issue. We're going to try not to politicize it too much. If anyone follows Jeff or I on social media, they know what our political views are. But we want to talk about this practically. As you say, should you buy a camera now? That's the real question. We can link in the show notes to previous episodes where we talked about used cameras. Do you need a second camera? We've had a couple of topics like that. I think, the time of year when most cameras get sold is the sort of spring to summer. People are preparing for the summer. All of a sudden there's sunlight out when, previously they got home from work and it was dark. And this is when cameras are often on sale or there's promotions to, buy a lens and get a discount or whatever. So I think we have a lot of people who were considering cameras who all of a sudden realize, well, if I'm going to have to pay 50% more in a week, I'm going to get it now. I think also we have a lot of people who are buying cameras now to sell them used after the tariff hits. Don't forget that.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think about that. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So there are a couple of things to unpack here. One of the things I'm glad you mentioned was that everything in that store when I was there will not be affected by the tariffs. And
right.
Again, like a lot of this is psychological. I will say that it would not surprise me, and I'm not putting shade on the owners of Kenmore Camera. I'm just in a larger sense. I fully expect that prices will go up even if it's on stock that is not affected by the tariffs, because companies are going to have that permission structure to be able to say, oh, well, you know what? Because of all the tariffs, inflation is rising, and so we can tack a little bit on here, a little bit on there. Now, I'm not saying that, the camera industry would do that.
It's probably not legal, and I think any retailer who does that could be in trouble potentially. I think what's going to happen, let's take Apple as an example. The Wall Street Journal had a graphic showing how much it would cost to build an iPhone. I think it was $537, and with the tariff it would cost $868. But this was assuming the 54% tariff, so we're not even sure whether it's going to be $104. I think what Apple is going to do, they won't raise their price immediately. They brought in a bunch of phones. They'll have enough to sell for a little bit. At some point, they have to decide, do we raise the price of the iPhone and every other product that Apple sells, or do we eat some or all of the difference? Mm-hmm. Now, apparently Apple has like a 45% profit margin on products like iPhones. So they could eat some of it, but they can't do that for too long. They can't go into September and eat the tariff cost on iPhones when new iPhones come out.
Yeah. Well, and also Apple's a great example and also sort of a bad example because they are masters of inventory. They're masters of the supply chain. And they are masters of the profit margin. And so, yeah.
And they're masters of printing money.
Well, because of all of those things. And so they have a huge advantage right now. And honestly, I would not be surprised if they keep things as stable as they can, even if it does eat into their profit margin. And knowing Apple, having something eat into their profit margin, like they do not like to do that. They really like their profit margins. But this is something that they could do. They also, as you mentioned, they're bringing in plane loads of stock so that won't be affected by tariffs. So now take that same situation and put that towards some of the camera companies. So we've talked about Fuji in the past because we both shoot Fuji, but also in terms of the Fuji X100VI, which is always back ordered. It's been back ordered since
since the X100V.
Exactly, yeah. That's not a situation where Fuji has warehouses of inventory that they're just waiting to ship over. They are, I would assume, making these as fast as they can sell them. And so anything that comes up in the next, several months, like that's going to get hit by a tariff. So that also affects your buying decision. Well, do I want to keep waiting for the X100VI because that is going to cost me more money unless stores have worked out of some sort of price guarantee. Maybe, some retailers will eat some of the profit. So many things in flux. I hate to be the person that says, yeah, now is the time to go panic buy.
Well, it's too late. Well, it's almost too late.
Yeah.
Depending on what you can get before the tariff price is added. The X100VI, forget about it. You won't get it at pre-tariff price. You'll be able to get a new iPhone. If you've been thinking about getting a new iPhone and you've been thinking of waiting until the iPhone 17, maybe you want to buy an iPhone 16 now. Depending on how old your iPhone is, instead of paying twice as much for the iPhone 17. Mm-hmm. Cameras are a different story, though. They don't, we're just ending the slow camera season. And again, people are starting to buy because they're preparing for the summer. But I don't think people are going to be taking expensive vacations this year. So they might not even need fancy cameras to do that. I think the real question is your camera good enough? And the answer today is, unless you have a lot of disposable income, it probably is.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just pining for a lot of disposable income. But
So there's the used camera market, and that's really interesting because let's say you've got a bunch of cameras that you've been holding on to, and you think one of these days I'll sell them used. And we've mentioned MPB a number of times, or is it MBP? I keep forgetting which one it is.
It's the opposite of
We'll put a link
MacBook
in the
Pro,
show notes.
so Mac MPB.
So it's MPB.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're a good place to sell and to buy. Now, if new cameras prices are going up, then the used camera prices are going up. So should you sell your used camera in a month when the price is higher, or should you buy a used camera now or before the prices go up? It's really, in my decades on this earth, I have never seen a situation like this where we never saw tariffs. There were tariffs on steel. There were tariffs on imported cars from certain countries. Like there were tariffs for Chinese cars to come into Europe because they're so low priced that they would destabilize the market. So if you want to buy a Chinese car here, you pay maybe a little less than a local car brand, a British or European car brand, because it's a tariff. But you don't see it on something that you're used to buying where all of a sudden the price is going up. Now for us, I think the tariff in the UK is only 10% from things from the US, but we don't get anything from the US that's like electronic. All that stuff comes from China. So we're not affected by that here.
Yeah.
Hey, if you need a new iPhone, let me know. I'll buy one here and send it to you. You know, we're only talking about cameras and phones so far, but think about every single electronic device you own, whether it's a TV, whether it's a stereo, whether it's I wanted to say white goods like refrigerators, but I don't know where they're built for Americans, maybe Mexico. They might be built. They wouldn't be shipped from China. But there are a lot of things. I mean, Nike sneakers are made in Vietnam. I think most sneakers are made in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, all those countries. So pretty much everything you buy that's not made in the U.S. is going to be hit with a tariff. And most of them are China, Southeast Asia, which are high tariff countries. Japan is actually low. They're something like 30% compared to some of the other countries. But you don't get a lot that's manufactured in Japan.
Part of the difficulty of this for me is that, A, we don't know exactly what's going to happen. We don't know how companies are going to respond. We don't know what the shipping and the storage and the manufacturing pipelines are going to go. Actually, when I was thinking about Fuji, I was also thinking of other companies that may not be as affected because they don't do their assembly in China. So Leica, for example, Leica hand builds all of their stuff in Europe. But that's still, I think there's a 20% tariff on the EU, which Germany is affected by.
Yeah, I think 20%. Yeah.
So that's still going to increase the cost of your Leicas down the line. And I don't have a good sense of, like, I know that Leicas are handmade. I don't get a sense of how much stock they build up before something is released, or if it's also kind of like Fuji where you're sort of doing almost just-in-time manufacturing.
From what I've read on the forums, and my Leica usage is a bit limited, but generally when a new Leica is announced, it may take up to 6 months to get one because of pre-orders, initial demand, et cetera. Yeah. So it's handmade. It's not done in a factory. It's, you can go on YouTube and find a video of all the people in the clean room putting the things together and checking the screws and everything. So it's a process that is not something they can ramp up very easily. They can't just hire 100 new people to build Leicas. This is a very skilled type of job. Right. Now, this, of course, leads into the big question of what the purpose of these tariffs are. If those of you who don't know, Donald Trump actually took out a full-page ad in the New York Times in 1987 calling for tariffs to replace income tax. It seems like the only thing he's ever been fixated on in his life is this idea of tariffs. And I think a couple of days ago, he posted something on social media that the U.S. was at its richest between 1870 and 1913. There was no income tax and only tariffs. That's a really short-sighted view of history.
Yeah.
The problem with all this is Trump has been saying that, okay, we're going to have these tariffs so we can rebuild manufacturing in the United States. Now, I don't know how many of our listeners have seen videos of some of these factories in China that are the size of like small towns, some of them, where the employees live in dormitories, 6 to a room, and work, 3 shifts and all that. And while these aren't sweatshops, these are very difficult jobs. Now, think what you need to do to make that factory. Think what you need to do to make the factories to build the components that go into the devices. Think what you need to do to get the employees who want to work in these jobs. And where in the United States can you put a factory, get enough employees, and have an energy grid that can support these factories? Certainly not California, certainly not Texas, both of which have really weak energy grids. It would take 10 years to build something like that to make it worthwhile. Now, if you look at China, China has the advantage of thinking long term, like a century, right? And they don't have a president who's elected for every 4 years, and that allows them to do things a little bit differently. Starting in the 1980s, China invited companies, Western companies, to come to the country and build factories for them. And they would get these contracts to build factories or nuclear power plants, for example. My ex-wife was a safety engineer designing nuclear power plants. And one of the requirements was what's called a transfer of technology. You build the factory and you give us the blueprints so we can build the next one. And very slowly over decades, China has been building this up. A podcast I was listening to the other day, I don't remember which one it was, said something like Huawei, the big telecommunications company, spends something like 30% of their revenue, not net, but their gross revenue on research and development.
Yeah.
The Chinese government has gone all in on training engineers, on building cities to house people, to build these goods. I mean, this is a decades-long investment that they've made to become the factory of the world.
Yeah. Well, and also it doesn't help that I think it was Trump's Treasury Secretary the other day who basically made the analogy saying, well, all the people that have been fired from the government, they can be put to work building iPhones and things like that.
No, screwing in screws for iPhones.
Yeah, exactly. It's nonsensical. It's impractical. And I mean, typical of Trump, again, not getting political, but we can't help it here, is that he just sees a big fat bottom line of here's money that's being added to the coffers. There's no consideration that a lot of this money comes from us, from American taxpayers. And of course, it should be obvious, but it needs to be said, absolutely short-term thinking. There's no long-term thinking at all because, we're looking at this also in the short term because we're looking at, all right, how much is a camera going to cost next week? How much is a camera going to cost next year? What is going to, I think, hurt even more is how much are these components. Let's say we can build a factory, a rudimentary factory for something. So much of the resources that go into a phone, a camera, those come from elsewhere. The steel and the aluminum and all of the chips.
It costs billions of dollars to make a chip fab.
Exactly. And so it's not just, will this assembled thing be costing us more money? This is super damaging to the U.S. economy over a very long term because that stuff is not going to get replicated here. It's not going to ramp up in any time, soon. And you just end up with a situation where also nobody in the world is going to trust the U.S. to do any of this.
Yeah. And even on top of that, I've seen numbers about tourism to the U.S. that have been plummeting. Canadians are boycotting U.S. goods, obviously, because America wants to take over Canada. It's getting to the level of ridicule, like something in a Thomas Pynchon novel, and not reality.
Yeah.
I want to just shift before we finish to talk about the best-selling camera in the world, which is on the iPhone. And in 2 months, Apple is going to have the Worldwide Developer Conference. So they'll be presenting the new operating systems, but that's going to lead into the phones and new features in the operating systems that need the new phones. And if they're not going to sell many new phones, then these new features are useless. And I have a prediction I want to make.
Okay.
Tim Cook will retire before the end of the year.
Oh.
And I say this because in recent videos presenting Apple products, he looks really old. And this doesn't look like a fight that he can fight. the tariff fight. This is a big deal, what's going on, and it's not going to end in a month or two. And this would be a good time to hand the reins to someone else. Anyway, that's just speculation. I'll bet you a beer on that or whatever. But I think if Apple's going to be introducing new hardware, which they often do at the WWDC, we've been waiting for an upgraded Mac Pro, right, for a couple of years. It might be time for that. Will they be able to introduce it? Now, there is apparently a factory for Mac Pros in Texas. I don't know how many Mac Pros Apple builds. Maybe that factory in Texas is enough, but they're still bringing components in. And the processor is one of the most expensive components. So there's no way they can, wipe that off the cost of the Mac Pro. So I don't know. This is, the volatility we've seen in the stock market with prices dropping and then slowly increasing. And in particular, I just looked at Apple. Apple's stock has gone down 19% in the past week. Not that the share price is everything, but this shows that people think that Apple is one of the most affected companies. Yeah. Other things like Nvidia is down 7% and Microsoft is down 4% in the past week, and Tesla obviously down 8%. But it shows that Apple is going to be the sort of poster child for these tariffs, I think, in the U.S.
Yeah. The fact that this is a thing that touches most people's lives because most people have an iPhone, or if they have an Android phone, it's analogous enough that you could sort of use the iPhone as the stand-in for it.
It's not because the cheapest iPhone you can get is $600. You can get a decent Android phone for under $200. And this may push more people to buy Android phones, cheap Android phones, instead of iPhones.
Possibly. But what I meant with that was that when it comes to things like tariffs, that, as you said earlier, was something that we never ever had to think about. The iPhone and therefore the category of phones, the category of personal electronics,
right,
that makes people think of what's going on. How am I going to afford this next thing? Should I put off my buying decision? And actually, one thing that you mentioned before we started that I want to make sure we hit on is the possibility that some products will just go away.
Right. That some manufacturers, rather than apply these tariffs and price themselves out of the market, will just stop selling them in the U.S. The world is huge. The world is not just the U.S. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of places they can sell these products without having to worry about this reputational damage of, the Nintendo Switch 2, I believe it starts at $449. They can't sell that for $900, right? They can't. It's something for kids. It's something for people who don't necessarily have a lot of income. Maybe they'll just decide not to sell it in the U.S. until this boils over.
Wow. I doubt that, but I don't see them selling it at $450 now.
Here's another possibility. Samsung, they make a whole bunch of TV sets. Maybe they'll reduce by half the number of models that they sell in the U.S. in order to not have too much stock if the tariffs drop. Because if the tariffs drop, they will have paid the tariffs when they arrive in the U.S., right? And if the tariffs drop, they'll be stuck having paid the tariffs. Now, this only really applies to products that are stocked up, right? We saw Apple getting a whole bunch of iPhones by plane. Most of these things are shipped pretty quickly. I mean, when I buy an iPhone here, it's shipped from China to me. Right. So Apple doesn't stock a lot here except for their retail stores. So I think we're going to see a real shakeup in the electronics industry. I mean, in the end, we're here to talk about cameras and phones which have cameras. So,
camera bags.
Don't buy. Camera bags?
I think a lot of them are now made in China.
Any camera accessories. It's not, when we say cameras, it's cameras and lenses and any accessories. Bags aren't expensive enough that a 50% tariff makes a big deal, but a $500 lens, when you add the tariff, that's a big deal. Okay, we don't have any answers. I mean, the suggestion is if you need a new camera and you can get one now before the tariffs are added to the price, do it quickly. But again, if I had a camera store, what would I do? Would I raise my prices 10% because demand is increasing even before the tariffs hit? Maybe. Unless you have a deal with a manufacturer where you have to sell at their price, which I think is the case with a lot of camera manufacturers, right? Where you can't discount or raise the price, then maybe this is going to happen. And I think used cameras are going to go up in value, both selling and buying.
Yeah. Well, and also I think one last point I wanted to make is that this goes back to the ever-present question of, should I buy a new camera? And I think that if you were not planning to buy a new camera and you're thinking, oh, I need to panic, maybe this new Canon, new Sony, this is what I need to get. If the features of that are not dramatically improving your photo situation, then I would say probably not. Like if you have an old camera and you're really looking forward to moving up to something that has much better autofocus and all the new modern technology, then yeah, that makes that more appealing. But if you have, let's say, a Sony A7 IV and you're thinking, boy, I really need to jump on getting a 5, or maybe they're going to announce a 6 or something, maybe that's not as important, and certainly not worth going into debt over, even if it sort of hypothetically saves you several $100s in the future. If you can make the photos that you're taking now with the gear that you have, you don't necessarily need something that is incrementally better, only to theoretically save some money later. So that has to be part of the calculation.
And on the flip side, I can imagine that professional photographers are buying extra bodies and lenses now just in case.
Absolutely.
Because if their camera breaks, it's not even a question of what it will cost. It's will you be able to get it? And that's a big issue for people who depend on it. You think about what you're using right now, your computer, your microphone, and all these things. If something goes wrong with them, I hope you have Apple Care on your computer, because then Apple will have to take care of it. But if something goes wrong and you're not able to replace it and you need it professionally, then you're kind of in, what is it, in a creek, up a river, in a paddle, canoe, whatever?
Up a creek without a paddle, yeah. Screwed.
Right, yeah. Okay. So, we got nothing else to say, but we did want to discuss this. And I think the two most important things are use the camera you have, use the phone you have. If your phone is really old, buy one as quickly as you can, because you may not get a chance to replace it. And maybe even if you want a new camera, look at used before those prices go up. MPB and other places that sell used cameras. And also, if you buy a new camera after the tariffs hit and it costs twice as much as what it was worth, and then the tariffs go away and you go to sell it used and you only get 50% of what the original price was, you've lost 3/4 of the value. So, think long term here. You don't need a new camera. We have an episode. You don't need a new camera or something like that. And that's what we should just put on in the background, is like, repeat or something.
You don't need a new camera. Unless you really, really want one. No, sorry. You don't need a new camera.
Okay, we're not going to do snapshots. I actually had an interesting device I wanted to talk about, is snapshots, but it's probably made in China, so it's not worth talking about. So we'll maybe next time.
Good point. All right. So as a reminder to everybody, our next episode will be in 3 weeks from when this is released. But also, go to our Facebook group. Tell us, are you buying cameras? Are you affected by these tariffs? Are you thinking of buying something used or selling some of your gear now to get on top of it? We would love to hear your feedback on that.
Okay, until next time, Jeff.
Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast.